of Spiritualism. I'll do the first 100, and then we'll do the last 50 years into current time when we do the second part of my address, which is during our divine service. This is a day of experimental sessions because we have a lovely lady coming from Chichester, Sarah Woolman, who's coming at 1:30 to join us for mediumship. And then I will be doing the second part of the history of Spiritualism, and then we'll be having a little break, and then at 4 o'clock Ray will be talking about his dad, Derek Robinson, but as we know him as well as Mr. LAD, as he started his LAD company in 1982 for the propagation of Spiritualism and to take Spiritualism on the road. And he formed that company, and his first tour was with Doris Stokes and Gordon Higginson, Jesse Nason, Robin Stevens, and he took Spiritualism back into the town halls. So we'll be talking in the second part about Spiritualism, and also the talk that Ray will be doing at 4 o'clock. So even if you can't actually commit to watching it then, hopefully, because this is being live streamed, then you'll be able to save it in bite-sized pieces to be able to watch then. And if you are hopefully coming to the church anytime soon, then we have a display of all the famous mediums that have come to the church in the last 100 years. We've got also all the friends that we've had here at the church, some of the groups, and even some of the outings, and some of them go back to the 1930s, 40s, 50s. We've got some photographs of our presidents. We've got a board up on our link with United Spiritualists, and then we've also got, as I say, some nice photographs of some of our presidents. So I'm just going to set some papers from the side. Hang on one moment. And so this church was actually built as a purposely built church from land that was acquired, and as I say, it was built in 1925. Prior to that, we'd been in Wimbledon Broadway as the Wimbledon Spiritualist Mission. But as I say, we have to, when we talk about the history of Spiritualism, it didn't start with Wimbledon Church. It started way back, the first millennia. It started, you can look back in Roman times, and anyone that remembers that the medium actually stated, "Beware the Ides of March," because it was the 15th of March that Julius Caesar was killed by his fellow congressmen in their parliament. And there'd been biblical events. You've only got to see the Old Testament, and the New Testament is full of events of physical phenomena, of mediumship, Jesus obviously being a medium, talking, his sermons, the healing, So we know really that the actual ability of mediumship and healing and prophecy and having addresses from the spirit world go way, way back before Spiritualism. And we have a Witchcraft Act that was actually 1735. And in 1735, this act was put in. And in fact, it stayed for another over 200 years that it was in force, because Helen Duncan was the last person to be tried under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. But before that, we had the Witchcraft Act, and we had the Vagrancy Act of 1824, the Act 1848, and we'd had prophets such as Nostradamus, and Swedenborg was in the 17th century, and the teachings of Swedenborg, you can look online, books that he'd written. So that is really the very beginnings. But official Spiritualism, the birthplace of modern Spiritualism, doesn't actually start to 1848. And the reason that it comes in for 1848 is because that is the story of Hydesville. Now, Hydesville is in America, North America to be precise, not far from Buffalo in New York State, not far from Niagara Falls. And in this area, there was a tiny little hamlet called Hydesville. And we talk about Hydesville every year because the date is the 31st of March, 1848. And we try to celebrate that as really being the birthplace of modern spiritualism, because it was after that event that the media began to realise that something was going on. And, you know, when we started to have churches beginning to form, we started to have mediums developing their mediumship after that date of the 1848. You know, it started in America and then it came over to the UK. And Emma Harding Britton was one of the pioneers. She went to America. She learned to be a medium out in America, but brought it back to England. And, you know, Emma Harding Britton is definitely a pioneer that one needs to actually read about. And I do have a list of some of the pioneers that I would like to talk about. And I thought I'd do that in the first few minutes. But I also want to say hello to a few people, because I see that we've got our own Julie Caswell that couldn't be with us today, but is with us obviously remotely. We've got somebody called Ruskins that's joined. We've got Ashley that's here. So I'm seeing some of the people that have joined us, and I hope that people will catch us at some other time. And I'm just saying, excuse me, I'll just get myself a drink of water. I've got myself a can here. So as I start our history, I just want to talk about the 11 presidents that we've had here at the church, starting with our founder, Mr. Richard Arthur Bush, who was going to be ordained into the Church of England. He found Spiritualism, or Spiritualism found him. He had set up the Wimbledon Spiritualist Mission, say above a shop in the Wimbledon Broadway. And for the first 12 years, that is where everyone met. And then in 1925, this building was actually erected. We had some war damage in 1940s, and it was only closed for a few weeks, literally. People actually patched it together. When they came in and saw the altar, we still had 2 candlesticks and our Bible were there in a crater, and they were still standing up, which was wonderful. And as I say, we were extended, we were rededicated in 1953. Let's say Mr. Richard Arthur Bush was actually a chemist, and his family had the lavender fields at Mitcham, and he was one of the first chemists to actually steal the elderflower. And that was very popular, and he was able to donate funds for the building of the church, with the idea that the church would pay him back at some later date, which never actually, came to be, unfortunately. But luckily for us, Mr. Bush was then the president for he was 20 years the president, from 1913 to 1923. And in that time, those early years, we believe that there were many famous mediums that were coming to the church. We believe that we know that the creator of the greater world, Zodiac's medium, that she was actually coming and addressing people, because she founded the greater world in 1928. And that's Mrs. Winifred Moyes. And we know that there was quite a gathering of individuals that were around at that time. We also have a wonderful painting of George Spriggs, who was a physical medium at the turn of the century, and we know that he was involved with Mr. Bush, because we have this 3-foot painting of him, or picture, which is a lovely sepia photograph of him, and he was a fantastic physical medium of his day, and he was able to also see when people weren't well exactly what ailed them, what part of their body was in difficulty. And this was way really before we had many doctors that were doing that themselves. And, during that period of time, there were famous scientists and there were famous prominent people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle that we believe may even have been at this church as well. Another favourite pioneer of mine was William Stead. And if you can find William Stead online to read up on some of the books that he had written. And he famously was on the Titanic. And, I was able to go to a Titanic museum exhibition, and they had brought up part of this Titanic piece, and it was of two cabins, and one of the cabins was William Stead. And I thought that was amazing. I was able to write in the little visitor's book in San Francisco Museum that he was a pioneer of spiritualism. And how wonderful it was because, there is a great book that he wrote, and this book talks about the experience of passing over to the spirit world in the Titanic, and of how each member of the crew and all the passengers of the Titanic, he tried to keep them calm, and he also then got them to come onto this boat where they believed they were being rescued, but they had all actually perished in the Titanic. And this boat was taken into the spirit world, and it's the Blue Island is what the book is called, and it's a fantastic read. It's not a huge book, but it's actually fantastic reading, and it's very inspirational. And William Stead's life, because he was a newspaper man and a famous journalist of his day. And if I say anything wrong, then I'm sure that Julie Cass will then change for me. And looking to see a few other people. George has joined us, Dean, Kerry, my friend David Barnett, who I'm very pleased to say hello to. I know David, his mum has actually transitioned only in the last few days, and is just discovering, the wonderful spirit world. And we had that great session, our first hour and a half, talking about passing over to the spirit world, what the spirit world is like, and about end-of-life care. And as I say, that was with Dawn earlier this morning. And as I say, that we're just talking about those very early pioneers in that first sort of 10 years of the church being open, and how the churches began to be formed. As I say, that from 1848 right to probably 1858, we would find that there was half a dozen churches started to spring up across England. Some of our magazines started as early as 1853. There was a Yorkshire Spiritualist magazine that started in the 1850s. By the time of the turn of the century, the Light magazine, which Conan Doyle was in, and George Spriggs was in, and other ones, a famous magazine that's still in existence today. And we've got that as part of our exhibition. And, there's another book of magazines there from 1898, which is quite wonderful to actually see. Now, we actually had, from that time then, from the 1873 till the end of that first century, we had Sir William Crookes, another famous individual that was a scientist, that was a learned person that did many experiments. And Arthur Findlay was born in 1883. And Arthur Findlay was very important as well with some of the literature, some of the books that he'd written. And the Arthur Findlay College, because his home was turned into a college, which is known as Stansted Hall now, and it's where the SNU do much of their training. And as I say, The Rock of Truth is a fantastic book from Arthur Findlay. And as I say, that's all in really the first 50 years of spiritualism. So I just need another paper. I just wanted to read you off some more notable dates from that period of time. Let's say we started off by telling about the Witchcraft Act and the Vagrancy Act. In America at this time, so still before Hydesville, 1845, Andrew Jackson Davis resumed the work of Swedenborg after a gap of 73 years, because Swedenborg was guiding Andrew Jackson Davis, and they say he's another one of the pioneers. You know, he'd walk barefoot from town to town in America. He was at the White House. He gave Abraham Lincoln messages. One of his friends was arrested as a medium, and in court he stood up and said, well, my friend is only practicing our religion of mediumship. And the judge said, well, show me it's a religion. And Andrew Jackson Davis went to an ante-room and wrote down the first 6 principles of American spiritualism. He came back, he showed the judge, and the judge dismissed the case. He was also fundamental in setting up the children's schools, what you would call like Sunday schools, what we call lyceums. And he had a big role to play in American spiritualism. Say Hydesville, 1848, 1852. Mrs. Hayden brings American spiritualism to England. 1853, the first Spiritualist Church opened up in Keighley in Yorkshire. The church was opened by David Richmond, who had returned home from America, bringing with him a knowledge about spirit communication and mediumistic ability. In 1854, Robert Owen publicly endorsing the spiritualist philosophy. Now, Robert Owen was a famous Fabian of the time. I think he was head of the co-op. And the first spiritualist publication in the UK was 1855, and that was the Yorkshire Spiritualist Telegraph. So if you think we're going back, you know, we're actually going back more than the 100 years. We're going back into mid-Victorian times for that. Then we had, in 1871, the prominent scientist William Crookes investigating spiritualism and publicly endorsing the spiritualist philosophy. In 1865, we had Emma Hardy in Britain returning to her native land, England, and demonstrating her gift of mediumship and inspired semi-trance public speaking. Now, the College of Psychic Studies, which is still going today, actually opened its doors in 1864. It's the oldest spiritualist organisation, and its official publication, Light, is still in circulation, and that's what I have, a magazine from the 1895. And then the Two Worlds magazine, which unfortunately is no longer independently itself. It was merged into Psychic News and has a much smaller distribution. That was actually formed in 1887, so a long time. Now, going then into the beginning, almost touching on the 100, because it's 1913, which was the year this church opened. Sir Oliver Lodge, one of England's greatest physicists, became champion of spiritualism as he endorsed survival and the philosophy of spiritualism. And then another great pioneer of spiritualism, and has written several books on the history of spiritualism, is Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, publicly endorsing the spiritualist philosophy, and that was in 1918. And then, so 1925, we opened the church, and it was consecrated by the Reverend George Val Owen. And I just wanted to read you a little bit about the Reverend Val Owen, because, you know, we obviously have a painting of him up in this corner, and it's very important to read this little bit of a story. Let's say at Wimbledon Spiritualist Church, our healing room is named the Val Owen Sanctuary. And this little bit of information, because he was a pioneer of spiritualism. Now, he was a Church of England vicar, ordained in 1893. He'd been born in Birmingham. He is remembered for his 4-volume works titled Life Beyond the Veil, The Lowlands of Heaven, The Highlands of Heaven, The Ministry of Heaven, and The Battalions of Heaven. These are still in print today. The first was published in 1921. And just a few words that have been condensed, and with the help of Julie Caswell in putting these. In 1913, the Reverend Val Owen was sitting in his vestry after evening song and was inspired to pick up his pencil and paper and sit quietly. He began to get automatic writing. These were messages from his mother, who had passed to spirit in 1909. He would ask his mother questions about the afterlife, and she would reply through automatic writing. The Reverend Val Owen went on to communicate with many spirits on all different levels in the spirit realms. He compiled these messages into books. These were published in the newspaper, the Weekly Dispatch. These books were very popular with people from all walks of life. They didn't sit well, however, with the Church of England, as he was promoting spiritualism, so he was asked to leave his parish. This left him with no job or home. He would not accept payment for his books, as he felt they were not his words, and he wanted to spread the message of spirit to all humanity with the love that was freely given to him. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, another amazing pioneer of spiritualism, set up a trust fund to financially support the Reverend George Val Owen, and he would go to travel around and give lectures here and in America about spiritualism. He passed to spirit in 1931 and still works today from the other side of the veil. He has been known to communicate in spiritual circles worldwide, including Brazil. And I know in the 1930s, the Church of England actually sent in an investigative team to see what spiritualism was about. And because everything that came back was that there was no difference between that and what everyone was going into their churches, the Church of England, that they didn't publish the report until about another 50 years later, because they were hoping it would dismiss it all as rubbish, and it didn't. And then we had several reverends that came from the Church of England and became spiritualists. So that's why we have the George Val Owen Sanctuary here, and his books are still important to us here at the church. And they were very important times, you know, for the 1900s right through to 1930. And in fact, I was reading a book which showed that we actually filled the Albert Hall in 1930 with spiritualists, and Arthur Conan Doyle had spoken there. But with his passing, there tended to be a period of sort of flux with spiritualism. But it had its revival, obviously during the Second World War, because so many people were being lost, so many families were affected by, you know, losing their sons and husbands and brothers, that it had a bit of a revival. But when you read this, I read this book from 1930, they were saying, where is spiritualism going? Obviously there had been an influx in the First World War because of the loss of life, but that had sort of started to settle again. And because churches had developed, spiritualists were coming into their churches, and they weren't necessarily taking spiritualism on the road. So unless you knew someone really well, you could know them as a neighbour, and you'd never have any idea that they were spiritualists. And we've never been a religion that knocked on doors and said, you know, you won't be saved unless you believe in the spiritualist philosophy, because we believe everyone has their own spiritual path to go on. And if you're not ready for that spiritual path, then there's not going to be any sanctions. You're not going to go to hell. But the fact is that, you know, it was only then a little bit later that we started to bring meetings back. In fact, William Stead, he'd opened up a centre in the aftermath of the beginnings of the century. But then his daughter was running, and then he said to his daughter he wanted that closed because he wanted to get spiritualism out on the road again. But as I say, do look up William Stead, because one of our pioneers that we really need to talk about. But that takes us really to 1930s, and then we had some of our famous mediums that were working in the 1930s. Helen Duncan was a famous physical medium. How many of you heard of Helen Duncan? Hopefully our regulars, a few that haven't. Thank you. And with Helen Duncan, she actually was charged under the Witchcraft Act of 1735 and put in Holloway in 1942. And the reason being that it wasn't that her mediumship was fraudulent, it was the fact that they wanted to shut her up because she was producing such phenomena at her seances that there were young men that were coming from spirit into her circles, and you could tell what ship they'd been on. And unfortunately, the War Office were not happy that people were finding out that their ship, the ship had gone down, because their son was coming and telling his parent, they're having to be at the seance, that the ship's gone down, Mum, and I'm in the spirit world. So she was put in Holloway for 18 months under the Witchcraft Act. And it was in the 1940s that there was a big petition to change the Witchcraft Act. And that was, that had been used for 200 years. So it's awful to think that they used an act that was 200 years old at that point so that they could shut up Helen Duncan. There's been at least 4 or 5 books written about Helen Duncan, even by her family. And Maurice Barbanel, who was the editor of the Psychic News, and he was the medium for Silverbirch, actually has written a good book on her as well, her life. And the thing is with Helen, it wasn't the fact, as I say, even though they're saying she's a fraudulent medium, when her the people that were defending her at the Old Bailey said, well, we can do a séance now and you can see for yourself, they said that wasn't in doubt. They didn't want a séance because obviously it would prove that she wasn't a fraudulent medium, but they just obviously wanted to shut her up. And Helen really had a little bit of a sad life when we consider how badly treated she was, because she passed before she should have done, because, even later in the 1950s, the police raided a séance of hers and tried to grab ectoplasm, which then burned all round her stomach area and other places where the ectoplasm had gone back into the body. And she passed away some weeks after that. So it was obviously as the result. And a lot of physical mediumship seemed to sort of disappear from the spotlight because people were saying, well, it was, too dangerous. That they weren't going to, have police raid the seances and things, So that was ridiculous. But as I say, it's taken us to the 1930s up to the 1940s. Mr. Bush passed in 1933. So not only did we lose Mr. Bush, we left Conan Doyle had passed as well in 1930. We had Mr. New Begin had taken over in 1933. And there are a couple of photographs of Mr. New Begin that are on our wall, which is just above where Doug is sitting in the armchair. So we've got our president, Mr. Gillespie, and we've got Mr. New Begin as photographs on that wall. And as I say, Mr. New Begin was here until 1935, and he completed 2 years as president. And then between 1935 to 1949, President Mr. Gillespie did 15 years. Also around that time, we had another president came to us in 1949, which was Jim Blackman. He'd been... It's a really interesting story about how Jim Blackman had started to come to this church almost by accident. It was as though he'd been driven to be here. And how, as I say, he was president then for 17 years. And it's the beginning of that period of time. Though he was only president to 61, he still came to the church, and then Ray has that connection from each president after that, with the exception of nobody really knows Edith Turner. She was here in the 1960s, 66 to 71. So she did 5 years, but she didn't stay on afterwards. And the really strange story about Edith Turner was that when she did pass, she had a funeral. She was part of Orthodox religion again. I think possibly even Baptists, though Ray would definitely confirm it, but asked at the end to have a spiritual service, and that the Baptists had to come because they were going to be left money in her will, but only if they sat and listened to the spiritual service. So it was quite a cool funeral, you could say, a cold response, because obviously most of them were Baptists. They didn't want to be as part of that. But a bit of a strange story where it comes to Edith Turner. Going back to our notable dates then, now that we've gone to the 1930s, and let's just go back to, so the Psychic News was formed, Arthur Finlay and Maurice Barbanel, 1932. In 1937 to 39, that's when the Church of England produced a report on their findings on spiritualism, and this report was held back until recent years. Helen Duncan was arrested and imprisoned under the Witchcraft Act, we know, and it was appealed in 1951 by the Home Secretary, Mr. Tutor Eade, and replaced with the Act from then. So it went from the Witchcraft Act to the Fraudulent Mediums Act. And so 1956 was the year that the police raided another of Helen Duncan's seances in Nottingham, and several weeks later, 36 days in fact, so only just after a month after this seance, she died. Partly it is claimed due to the shock of being disturbed from her trance state and from the ectoplasm going back into her body. So it is very much a shame that that is what happened with Helen Duncan. So as I say, we've started with our pioneers of the 30s and the 40s, going now into the 1950s. And as I say, the 50s and the 60s were a fairly quiet time here at the church. It was just a stable time. So Jim Blackman had 11 years here with the presidency to 1961. Mr. Brake was then here for 5 years, from 61 to 66. And there are some photographs on our display boards over there that show a photograph of Mr. Blackman, who is doing the wedding service for Mr. Brake, who married in later life. So it's nice to see a wedding picture. But as I say, this elderly couple were actually Mr. and Mrs. Brake. So that's our history that takes us to 1966. And then, as I say, Edith Turner is a period of time that we know very little about the church. Very little is written about the mid-60s to 71. Then 71, that's really, we're coming in now to our last sort of 50 years then of the history. And we could sort of say, if we end it on the 1975, now I met Bill Murray. He was president here for 5 years. A couple of you might remember Bill Murray. I know that Mary would. I don't know if Daphne and Ivor remember. I don't know if Cherie, if you knew Bill Murray in the 1970s. But he was here. He was at Hill House as well. He opened up the White Rose Centre. But he brought a circle here that was at the run in Putney, and that's when Fernie was part of the church as well. And she was a really beloved lady here at the church that was on the committee for at least 15, 20 years. But there was a large group of people that came, that were in a circle in Putney, that all came en masse here in 1971. And that was when Ray came in with his dad in 1971. So he's actually been here at the church now for 54 years. But as I say, I will talk about the other 50 years in the talk that I do that little bit later on. And obviously we got married in 1979 here as well, and there are some wedding pictures and some christening pictures and things that are on the board. And one of the very, very fine medium of his day was Robin Stevens, and he was the minister that conducted our wedding in 1979. And as they used to do experimental mediumship, where he would sit here and he would be turned with his back to the audience, just looking at the curtains, and he would be blindfolded, and he would do photopsychometry, and he would do all sorts of other experiments. So very fine medium. But as I say, in the mid-70s, we also had a bit of a dispute with some individuals that were our church that felt they needed to leave because they were going down the route of the SNU. Now, I don't know if any of you know, but there are several factions within the spiritualist movement. We're an independent church, but we're affiliated to United Spiritualists. in the since the war years, right through to the 1970s, we'd been affiliated to the SNU, the Spiritualist National Union, and we'd also been affiliated to the Greater World. And the Greater World was a Christian spiritualist organisation. But at that time, you could belong to more than one organisation. But as I say, in the 70s, we started to, see different directions. You were either in one line of individuals saying that spiritualists have no right to have any other dogma, no church will be allowed to have a cross, or any other symbol of any other traditional religion, that you just had to be pure spiritualist. So the Greater World were just there for Christian spiritualists. And as I say, we became an independent church where we believed that it was all about labels and that we wanted to encompass everyone coming to our church and feeling happy regardless of what religion they may have grown up in. So we feel that's very important. It's that liberty of interpretation that is important to us. And we're not a church that makes people read out a belief and pledge. I believe that some of the traditional churches that may either be in the Greater World or the SNU may still read them out. I know it says, their belief and pledge for every service. Whether they do, because I've been in spiritualist churches that are SNU and I've seen crosses. So I think it really just depends on who's running the church and who decided what they should kick out and what they shouldn't kick out. But we have a beautiful stained glass window, and you'll see, the wonderful picture of that. And I just want to read you about the stained glass window. That's okay. And it's on a lovely board, so you can read it again afterwards. A beautiful stained glass window was put in place around 1953 when the church was rebuilt. It was generously donated by Mr. and Mrs. C.W. Whiteley, who were members of Wimbledon Spiritualist Church. And really, it says to the love of God and in honour of the pioneers of this church. And we actually had to have another 2 bricks built in this part of the church higher so that the stained glass window would be able to fit. Now, its current location was open for services in 1925. Our founder and first president, Mr. Richard Arthur Bush, had started Wimbledon Spiritualist Church in 1913, formerly known as the Wimbledon Spiritualist Mission, in rented rooms above the shop. Now, during World War II, in December of 1941, the church was hit by an incendiary bomb. Past president, Mr. Jim Blackman, who was vice president of the church in 1941, was on fire duty on the evening of the bombing. After hearing that the church had been hit, he made his way to the site. He was met by the majority of the church destroyed. Jim found within the large crater where the church stood the church Bible still resting on the brass lectern, 2 brass candlesticks and large cross. All these items are still within the church today. When viewing the initial architect drawings, it seemed the original purpose-built Wimbledon Spiritualist Church was slightly smaller, seating 248 people. After the rebuild in 1925, we can sit at a squeeze 300 people. And in fact, when we got married in 1979, we had 304 people here. That was a sort of a capacity. You'll see from some of the photos of the church that we've got laid out on our displays that the chairs were smaller. They were more the size of the golden ones at the front, and we've still got 2 original church chairs left, and they were in little pews of 4. Sorry, Ray?
We've got 4 of the original churches.
Yeah.
Chairs.
And we had them upholstered in the 1970s because they were just wood at that time. So at least we had a little bit of comfort on them. But as I say, it went to 300. But as I say, the front part of the church, did survive, and they just blocked off the rest of the church, and they still managed to have services then throughout the Second World War. And as I say, you'll see the wonderful stained glass that we're very lucky to have. And there's no way when the SNU said in the 1970s, you have to choose to be pure spiritualist, or you have to, choose to get rid of crosses, that we would have ever done anything to our stained glass window. I just put this down.
I actually told Jimmy Collins the first thing we'd have to go would be his stained glass window. Either board it up or sell it. They wrote to Jimmy Collins about crosses as president, and he said, I noted your letter, and I did look at the cross on our altar wall, and I did decide to take it down, but I put a bigger one up in its place.
I don't know if people can hear that on the audio, but Ray's just saying that we put a bigger cross when told that we should take our cross down. So it was decided that we would have a bigger cross. And the importance as well, because in 1985 Ray was ordained minister with the Greater World, and they wanted people. I was a junior member on the committee at that time in 1977, and was told that he would have to leave the committee, even though he'd been on the committee since the early 70s. And you'd have to leave the church, that's right. So I always refer to them as the Troubles, so that period of time from the 1970s. And SNU mediums were told that they weren't allowed to serve our church, that we weren't able to see eye to eye with that. But as I say, that takes us right through to the end of 75 with Bill Murray, and it also takes us then to the first 50 years of Wimbledon Spiritualist Church. And as I say, when I talk to you again after Sarah's demonstration, then I'll be telling you about the next 50 years from 1975, obviously to 2025, and also a little bit then about the LAD years and the different things we do at the church to encompass those. And I'm just checking who else was joining us. We've yes, I did. Yes, and we have a Laura, and we have a Kelly, and looks as though we had Christine and Lynn and Tinkerbell. So that's nice to see that people have been able to come with us and join part of us. As I say, that takes us to 12:30. I've spoke a little bit about the Reverend Val Owen. I've spoke a little bit about George Spriggs, but I just want to tell you one story before I leave. And I was a few minutes later in starting while you were all coming in. And it's strange because for, almost 50 years, we had forgotten who George Spriggs was, because it doesn't say his name on the picture. In fact, we had his picture up here.
Sorry to butt in again, but when I came here in the 70s, nobody here knew who that picture was.
That's right. We didn't, did we? And that was the case right through.
It was when I first came here as a kid in 1971. Yeah. Nobody knew it.
No. And in fact, we decided we'd take it down and we were going to store it in the loft. And then we had this sort of
I sent the picture off for investigation.
Yes, to ask if anyone actually recognised it. And I said there's an article, because we also found some old magazines of light, and there was an article about George Spriggs from 1895. And I've just got some words I want to share about George Spriggs. Just bear with me, for those who can hear me. Okay. And this, in case people hadn't seen our picture of Val Owen, because you're only looking online, this is Val Owen. And with George Spriggs, it's the famous story. It's actually a story when he was doing a tour of Australia, and he did physical mediumship in seances in broad daylight. He didn't believe he needed any darkness, and on this one occasion in this tour in Australia, there was a commotion of people that were all dressed in Victorian costume in the garden of this house where he was doing this seance. And it was discovered that these were individuals that had gone there, and they were actually spirit people, but they had manifest themselves in physical form, ready to attend the seance. And apparently they were saying about the noise. People were complaining locally, the noise of these people talking. And I thought that was absolutely amazing. But this is, so I'm just going to put that a little bit closer so you can see the picture. And it says here, just going to read a little bit, and this is as published in the Light magazine of October 1895. With one or two somewhat marked exceptions, the mediums I have met have been exceedingly modest and unassuming persons. Mr. George Spriggs, I think it may fairly be said, is the most modest of them all. He can well afford to be, for no one who knows him but speaks of him in the highest possible terms as a man of transparent integrity, in whose good sense, veracity and consistency the fullest confidence may always be felt. Given to him by the London and Spiritualists need not again be given here, for the reader, turning back to it, will find intelligent and pleasant features, according well with the characters described. Everything worth mentioning, he said, has already been printed in one or other of the Spiritualist papers, and though it is an excuse you have heard before, that the medium is less satisfactory of all narratives of the phenomena connected, as a rule, he does not witness them or indeed know anything about them except second hand. But he was asked questions straight away, and on this one, they're talking about a particular, speaking with witnesses, and he'd been a medium for about 20 years at that point, and he was in Cardiff, and he'd made this acquaintance of an enthusiastic spiritualist who rushed in with his pet subject every opportunity, looking at some of the symptoms of interest, but it was actually saying it made a strong impression on his mind. Sorry, I've sort of lost my thread. But they were saying about some of his information, some of the different things. So they're probably a little bit too long to read you at this point, especially as we're coming on to that break now. So I'll see if I can put a few bits of this afterwards. But I know that some of the manifestations that had happened in Australia, so apologies for that. I will look again. And I say, I hope you found that hour interesting. It's now 25 to 1. And, I'll be back here at the end of our divine service. So we're all going to stop and have a little bit of lunch now. So hopefully you'll tune in again with us at 1:30. Thank you very much for listening. So warm up here. Now, I think we are still... Now, I'll ask Ashley to turn off the machine again.